Cut 2. Exterior, mid-shot, Amazonia. A woman sits in front of the camera. She's in the shade, evidently under the treetop canopy. Her face holds a history. She's waiting for something happening behind the camera. 8 years ago, caption. I met Maria 8 years ago, and she told me the story of creation. There is no beginning, nor end. Life, just life passing from one to another. She tells her story. Interior, mid-shot, home office. Grian sits at his desk. He holds a phone next to his ear. He's listening to someone on the other end. He looks concerned and worried. An Avalon project poster hangs over him. Caption, 55 days earlier.
Sí. Cada vez son más los activistas asesinados mientras intentan proteger sus tierras. No desesperes. Sigue luchando. Haré cuanto pueda por ayudaros. Tenéis mi apoyo. Amor y furia, hermano. In this struggle to avoid climate disaster, there are front lines. But this is something that is not taken into account in the global north. In the north, we talk about problems as if they affect everyone on the same level. But this is not the case, because the climate change bill will be paid by the peoples in the global south.
Acá todos están desarmados, estamos reclamando un derecho nada más. Bajen las armas, díganle al gobierno.
Environmental activists in the north can be arrested and released after a few hours, perhaps with a fine. However, environmental activists in the global south are being killed. Between 2002 and 2017, 1,558 environmental activists were killed worldwide, the vast majority in the global south, 75% of them in Latin America. They are being killed while trying to save the lives of all the people on the planet. Because the true front line of this unequal battle is in the global south. Yes, we are waging a real war. Not only for the ecosystems and the rest of the community of life on Earth, but also for the survival of our own species. According to prominent members of the academic community, there is currently 1 probability in 20 of human species becoming extinct throughout this century. This is rarely reported in the media. People don't want to hear these things. And the media journalists don't want to lose their audience, even if that means losing their lives in the medium term. But things look even worse when we learn that, according to some studies, the Permafrost Fall, expected to take place in Canada by 2090, is already taking place. And if permafrost was to thaw completely, climate change would spiral out of control. 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial species could become extinct, as it happened during the Great Permian-Triassic extinction. We are facing the greatest emergency that human species has ever faced in its history. Because of humans, the rate of species that become extinct is well over 100. And our own species is on the way to extinction. Unless drastic and urgent measures are taken. But how did we get to this point? We have a problem. We have a problem in our way to see the world. We have a problem in our way to see the world. Leading academicians, both from the social and natural sciences, have been pointing out for years that the problem that has brought us to this planetary emergency is our own worldview. In fact, the French philosopher Bruno Latour holds that any attempt to sustain life in the critical zone of the planet goes through leaving modernist epistemologies behind. According to Latour, modernity opens a gap between nature and society, establishing an extremely marked separation between them. This modernist framework underlies institutions, mechanisms, and processes which produce environmental degradation. It even underlies social movements, inhibiting their evolution into networks able to mobilize agents to effect the transformations called for by what he calls the new climate regime. This is something that I have been able to witness firsthand as a climate activist within the well-known social movement Extinction Rebellion. Certainly, I came to suggest it to the XR Spanish coordination team in its first weeks of life by asking the group, how do we intend to tackle the climate emergency with enough guarantees of success if so many of us continue to support the same worldview that has brought us to this critical point? The modernist worldview has its roots in the Judeo-Christian worldview, and its trunk and branches are the conceptions of reality of the classical Newtonian Cartesian scientific paradigm. Its main characteristics are its anthropocentric worldview, which sees the human being at the pinnacle of creation or of evolution, the center of priorities, and everything on earth has to be subordinate to them. Modernism is also characterized by its mechanism and its materialism, from where nature and the earth with all its beings are seen as if it were an immense machine, something like a clock, without feelings, without a soul, something inert and insensitive, that gives us permission to squeeze and exploit everything around us without consideration, without feeling guilty about the damage caused. And its unbridled rationalism leaves out of the scientific equation not only emotions, such as love or sadness, but also ethics and aesthetics, that is to say, the good and the beautiful. And finally, its disjunctive and separating character divides reality into elements without any connection between them, into atoms, cells, which are unrelated to each other. In this way, this worldview prevents us from seeing wholes, systems, with their infinite interconnections between their innumerable elements. Undoubtedly, this worldview has brought great blessings to humanity in recent centuries, but it has exceeded its expiry date, finally leading to the current climate emergency and mass extinction. That is why we urgently have to catch up with the worldview that emerges from the new complex systems, a scientific paradigm, a worldview characterized by its ecocentrism. In other words, the Earth, with all her living and non-living systems, has to be the center of reality and the axis of priorities, since the human being is nothing more than a thread in the fabric of life. A worldview characterized by its organicism, seeing the universe and therefore the Earth as an organic whole, even as argued by the organic Gaia theory as a living organism. A worldview characterized by considering reason, emotion, ethics, and aesthetics in terms of equality, and by not dividing reality into its constitutive elements, but seeing it as a systemic whole in which processes, and especially the interrelationships and interdependencies between elements, is the cornerstone which holds that organic whole together and in operation. Therefore, we could affirm that we may have an opportunity to avoid the collapse of our civilization and mitigate the effects of climate change and the mass extinction of species. That is only if, while offering resistance to further exploitation and natural destruction, we manage to change the worldview of our civilization in time. I refer mainly, of course, of our Western world. But what can we do to change the worldview of an entire society? In addition to the implementation of transformative learning methods, present under different forms in a multitude of ancestral cultures, the method par excellence that all the cultures in history have used for the transmission of their worldviews has been that of their traditional stories, that is, their myths, legends, fables, and folk tales. Speaking about the most recognized of these cultural materials, that is, myths, Carl Gustav Jung wrote that they are a collective representation of symbolic processes. This representation adapts at every moment to the worldview of the culture that created and transmitted that myth, while Levi-Strauss forcefully stated that myths operate in men's minds without they being aware of the fact. In addition, Joseph Campbell said, civilizations are grounded on myth. Campbell argued that myths fulfill different functions in cultures and illustrated the determining influence that myths have on civilizations. He did this by showing how the differences between myths of East and West led to radically different civilizations in terms of expressions such as individualism or human relationship with nature. Campbell said that the rise and fall of civilizations during the course of history have been largely a function of the integrity of their canons of myth, for it is not authority but aspiration which can motivate, build, and transform a civilization. This is because the energies of aspiration are evoked and gathered through myths. By aspiration, we understand here what a person or society longs for, what they pin their hopes and their most cherished dreams on. This is the reason why aspirations cannot be expressed in rational language, but in mythical language. This aspiration is what makes us dream of other possible worlds. Thus, we can understand myths, and by extension, traditional stories, as ancestral high-tech devices or cartridges. This is because with a short narrative, easy to remember, and extremely viral in its diffusion in a community, all the many components of a society's worldview are gathered and spread. In this sense, stories are like cultural seeds. They are tiny cultural elements if we compare them with the huge tree which is a culture, but they contain within them all the DNA worldview of that culture. Not surprisingly, Grian A argues that it is necessary to recover the millenary cultures that were not modernized, that is, oral cultures, stating that there are more than 250 million Aboriginal human beings that modernization has tried to annihilate but has failed. Orality and oral traditions, using the spearhead of traditional stories and storytelling, can be that place from where we could contribute to ending once and for all the modernism which has brought us to the brink of extinction. Perhaps this is why we should not be surprised by a finding made during my inquiry into worldviews and traditional stories. In my research, I justified and validated that certain traditional stories selected from around the world are capable of transmitting the systemic and ecocentric worldview that we need to adopt in order to avoid or at least mitigate the environmental disaster looming over us. But then, in view of the fact that I had a good database from content analysis of 126 stories, it occurred to me to wonder if there could be differences between the stories belonging to oral cultures and those belonging to written cultures. The result was surprising. Stories from oral cultures showed more systemic components than stories belonging to written cultures, and this at the maximum level of significance. Interestingly, stories from the Aboriginal peoples of the Americas stood out in these terms above the rest of peoples and cultures on the earth. After justifying the idea that we can indeed shift the worldview of our societies through the telling of systemic and ecocentric traditional stories, we proposed the creation of a global bank of myths, legends, fables, and folk tales from all over the planet, specifically selected for this purpose. This bank of stories, which are illustrative of the Earth Charter, would be the cultural equivalent of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway. In addition, this bank of cultural seeds would become an ancestral version of the planetary mythology advocated by Joseph Campbell for these globalized times. This planetary mythology was launched in October 2019 under the name of the Earth Stories Collection. These stories are for public use, as they are offered on our website and in our books under Creative Commons license. On the other hand, and suggested by Donald Smith, founder and first director of the National Theatre of Scotland and director of the Scottish International Storytelling Festival, we later launched another project parallel to this, the Earth Storytellers. This is a global network of storytelling activists who are in charge of spreading these stories and the principles of the Earth Charter in their communities and cultures all around the world. As can be seen, in order to respond to the serious crisis we are going through, we have already launched a proposal from Cultural Creative Communication of Traditional Storytelling. It is a proposal in line with the approaches of Bruno Latour, which aims to end modernism once and for all through the dissemination and expansion of a systemic, ecocentric, organist, and integrative worldview. But the question which may assail us is this: will we be in time to change the worldview of an entire civilization?
There was an old lady from the Cree tribe named Eyes of Fire, who prophesied that one day, because of the white man's or Janegi's greed, there would come a time when the fish would die in the streams, the birds would fall from the air, the waters would be blackened, and the trees would no longer be. Mankind, as we would know, it would all but cease to exist. There would come a time when the keepers of the legend, stories, cultural rituals, and myths, and all the ancient tribal customs would be needed to restore us to health. They would be mankind's key to survival. They were the warriors of the rainbow. All the peoples of all the tribes would form a new world of justice, peace, freedom, and recognition of the Great Spirit. The warriors of the rainbow would show the peoples how to make the earth beautiful again. These warriors would give the people principles or rules to follow to make their path right with the world. These principles would be those of the ancient tribes. The warriors of the rainbow would teach the people of the ancient practices of unity, love, and understanding. They would teach of harmony among people in all four corners of the earth. Their children would once again be able to run free and enjoy the treasures of nature and Mother Earth. The rivers would again run clear, the forests be abundant and beautiful, the animals and birds would be replenished, the poor, sick, and needy would be cared for by their brothers and sisters of the earth, those who demonstrated their love, wisdom, and courage, and those who showed that they could and did work for the good of all, would be chosen as leaders or chiefs. The tasks of these warriors are many and great. There will be terrifying mountains of ignorance to conquer, and they shall find prejudice and hatred. They must be dedicated, unwavering in their strength, and strong of heart. They will find willing hearts and minds that will follow them on this road of returning Mother Earth to beauty and plenty. The day will come, it is not far away, the day that we shall see how we owe our very existence to the people of all tribes, the warriors of the rainbow that have maintained their culture and heritage, those that have kept their rituals, stories, legends, and myths alive. It will be with this knowledge, the knowledge that they have preserved, that we shall once again return to harmony with nature, Mother Earth, and mankind. It will be with this knowledge that we shall find our key to our survival.
If we want to survive as a species, if we don't want to sentence our children and grandchildren to the world of Mad Max, we will have to change in depth the way we see reality. We will have to look at the outside world from our deepest pain, seeing how life pervades everything, even the stones. And we'll have to humbly accept that we are not the chosen people among the species, that we are not more important than a blade of grass, than a lonely breeze, than a simple pebble lying on the ground and forgotten by time. We will have to accept our smallness and from it truly find our greatness as caretakers and custodians of life on a living and sentient earth.
And as for whether or not we will be in time to avoid disaster, personally, and based on Gregory Bateson and Donella Meadows, on Ilya Prigoggin's theory of dissipative structures, and the developments of Graham and Alistair Taylor, on the systemic model of historic evolution of societal systems, I believe that there is a silver lining to achieve such a feat. But explaining all this would be the subject for another presentation.